Hi everyone, and welcome back to the fifth video for the New Testament survey course. We're still exploring the background that influenced the history and ideas of the New Testament. And in this section, we'll explore the social and political background of the New Testament. We'll concentrate on some of the cultural dynamics of life in the time of Christ and what impact they had on the ideas and the events of the New Testament. First, let's look at the ways in which God had prepared the world for the coming of Christ. Paul tells us that Jesus came in the fullness of time, that is, at just the right time. And we can see how God had providentially made the world ready, not only for Christ, but also for the spread of early Christianity. You may remember from the last section that the Greeks conquered and ruled over the Promised Land for a time, and the major influences they gave to the New Testament were, first, the Greek language, which became the common trade language throughout the Mediterranean and Middle East. The New Testament was written in Greek, and so when the church spread throughout the Mediterranean, there was no language barrier to cross. And the second Greek influence is social and philosophical ideas. As the church expanded outside of Jewish areas, the church, and consequently the New Testament, speak about Jesus in ways that make sense to people influenced by Greek philosophy and philosophical ideas. Sometimes they agree with Greek philosophical ideas, sometimes they challenge and refute them. But the New Testament authors, especially Paul, they're aware of the Greek way of thinking and can speak to Greeks within their own conceptual framework. And after the Greeks, the Romans had control of the world of the New Testament. And the Romans were responsible for what is called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. The Romans conquered everyone and put down all uprisings, including banditry and piracy. And that led to a stability and a prosperity throughout the Mediterranean. And the Romans built roads and made travel safe and efficient. So the apostles were able to travel and spread the message of Jesus because of the Roman peace. And another benefit of the Roman peace was the Roman laws and legal system. Rome did a lot to bring justice and stability. And we can see that the Apostle Paul was sometimes able to gain a hearing and find protection because he was a Roman citizen. Now, certainly, Roman conquest was not all good, but remember, right now I'm highlighting those things that prepared for the New Testament and the spread of early Christianity. We'll look at some of the negative things in just a bit. But finally, I want to mention that the Jewish and Old Testament influence behind the New Testament. Just remember all the Old Testament background stuff we covered in a previous section, especially the Septuagint, which is the translation of the Old Testament into Greek. This prepared a Bible already available to the people to whom the apostles traveled and preached. And just one more thing I want to mention is the Jewish diaspora. That is, the dispersion of Jewish people outside of the Promised Land for various reasons before the time of Christ. So that by the time of the New Testament, there was a Jewish community in many of the cities throughout the Roman Empire. And when the church began to spread geographically, this Jewish community was the natural place to begin proclaiming Jesus in every city that they went to. Notice how Paul always started in any city by proclaiming Jesus in the Jewish synagogue. So God had prepared the world for the arrival of Christ and for the spread of the church through Greek, Roman, and Jewish influences in the time before the New Testament. So there were three general categories of social forces impacting life in the Promised Land in the time of Jesus. First is the Jewish culture and the Old Testament religion and expectations, which is by far the largest influence. But there was also the influence of Greek language and culture, and there was the unescapable impact of Roman politics and economics. The Romans were occupying the Promised Land in the time of the New Testament. You could not escape Roman taxes. and Roman soldiers were a regular part of life. And oftentimes, both the taxes and the soldiers were oppressive to the native Jews in the Promised Land. And these generated a lot of resentment toward the occupying Romans. And at that time, there were basically two classes of people among the Jews in the Promised Land. The first is the aristocracy, both political and religious leaders. The religious and political leaders were the respected higher class of Jewish life, and they were influential over all parts of social life in the time. And then the second class was everybody else, the common people, the farmers, fishermen, carpenters, the largest part of the population by far, but they had relatively little power and influence in everyday life. The temple in Jerusalem was the center of religious, political, social, and even economic life. But as mentioned in an earlier section, the synagogue functioned in the same kind of way as a social center in all the various local communities. And at this time, there were a number of Jewish groups in Israel when Jesus was ministering. In some ways, they were different social classes, but in some ways, they're almost like different political parties today. They shared an overall social philosophy and approach that differed from the other groups. And one of the ways we can differentiate them is to note their differing approach to the Romans. The first group was called the Sadducees. And for the most part, the Sadducees reluctantly collaborated with the Romans as a means to serve their own personal interests and to preserve the Jewish nation. These were the people of high social and economic standing, the people that controlled the temple and the high priesthood. They were a smaller elite group of they carefully protected their status by currying the favor of the Romans. They displayed a limited trust in biblical revelation. They only accepted the 5 books of Moses of the Old Testament. They didn't believe in the resurrection and future life. In other words, they were Jewish, but basically as secular as a Jew could possibly be at that time. They were the religious left of the day. And we can learn a lot about them from Jesus' evaluation of them. He basically ignored them for the most part. And when they did challenge Jesus, he brushed them off with, "You don't know the scriptures or the power of God." And he took sides against them in the theological controversies of the day. The next group is called the Pharisees. And the Pharisees were passively against the Romans. Their main focus was on keeping the law, on keeping the Sabbath, and the rules of purity. And they developed elaborate oral traditions explaining what the law meant and how it applies and how to keep it. Now, the Pharisees come off as the bad guys in the New Testament, and rightly so. But we need to be careful to understand how and why Jesus disagreed with them, or we may go too far. Because Jesus actually agreed with them on many issues. For instance, in some Christian circles, anyone who insists on upholding any kind of moral standard is mockingly called a Pharisee. Somehow they try to argue as if having any moral standards is a bad thing because the Pharisees had moral standards. But you see, the Pharisees were originally good guys, starting with the revival in the Old Testament books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And Jesus adopted the golden rule from the Pharisees. They were basically the religious right of the day. And the Pharisees were the largest and most well-known of these groups. And they also had a significant representation among the rulers of the people. And the Pharisees controlled most of the synagogues and the religious teaching of the day. But the Pharisees often looked down on the common people who were not as conscientious about keeping the law as they were. But the Pharisees were respected and admired by almost all the people. And of these Jewish groups, the Pharisees were actually probably the closest to Jesus in understanding and approach. And that actually is why there was conflict. And Jesus' evaluation of them was mixed, good things and bad. Like I said, the Pharisees started out very good, but over time they had gone bad in many ways. Jesus commended them for the most part on their teaching and their morality. He told people, do what they said, and he agreed with them on many issues. However, he criticized them because they were inconsistent in application. They did not practice what they preached, nor did they help others live up to their high standards. And they were wrong in motivation. They did moral things in order to be seen by others and to be thought well of by others. But his biggest criticism of the Pharisees by far is that they elevated human tradition over the Word of God. They substituted their own way and their own ideas for God's ways, while still claiming to follow God. And we need to be very careful not to follow in the same mistake. Now, the third group was called the Zealots, and they actively fought against the Romans, sometimes with terrorist-like tactics. They were primarily focused on political and military issues, and their number one goal was to defeat Rome and kick them out of the country. They were fiercely nationalistic. There was a variety of rebellions against Rome just before the New Testament period. And then after Jesus, there were final rebellions that were crushed by Rome in 70 and 135 AD, which basically ended Jewish national life in the Promised Land until 1948. Now, one of Jesus' 12 disciples was called Simon the Zealot, but Jesus actively resisted any notion that he would lead a rebellion against Rome. Then the fourth group was called Essenes, or Essenes. And their approach to the Romans was basically to ignore them. And they thought that almost all the Jewish society of their time was corrupted, and so they fled to the desert to start an alternate society. They lived away from the corrupt society, trying to be in communion with God and with one another. It was basically a monastic movement. They lived communal life away from the mainstream, and they had many specific rituals and a structured life of devotion. But they also had many teachings and practices that went beyond what the Old Testament scriptures taught. And this is the group that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, the Essenes are not mentioned in the New Testament, and some suggest that John the Baptist was influenced by them because of their rituals of bathing and baptizing, but there's no way to know for sure if he was. Then the last Jewish social group I want to mention was called the Am Haaretz. Translated, that means people of the land. That was the everyday people, farmers and tradesmen. And all their time was spent just trying to make a living and survive. So they weren't as conscientious about the law as the Pharisees. They weren't as involved in political processes as the other groups. But for the most part, they were still religious along the lines of the Pharisees. They looked up to the Pharisees, agreed with the Pharisees. They just were not as picky about it. They didn't have time or energy to go through all the things that the Pharisees did. Now, you learn in an earlier section that at the start of the New Testament time, there was a tremendous sense of expectancy and hope, as well as a tremendous sense of despair, frustration, and hopelessness. And the people of that time lived in that tension. There was just a powder keg of expectations and frustrations that often went off whenever a claimed Messiah came forward to lead a rebellion against Rome. And Rome always responded with overwhelming violence, crucifying thousands of Jewish revolutionaries, which of course caused much pain and further expectation and further frustration. The tensions were political, economic, religious, and sociological. But they were also theological tensions. The reality they were living in did not yet match their expectations of what God had promised. God had promised big things, tremendous things in the Old Testament that were not yet fulfilled. And so they were eagerly waiting for God's next move. And that is the theological idea and expectation that we're going to address in the next section. But now, let me try to summarize the social background of the New Testament. The Old Testament religion and culture, combined with Greek cultural influences, and combined with Roman politics, control, and economic oppression, that was life in Israel in Jesus' day. Some Jews responded by collaborating with Greek culture and Roman politics. Some Jews responded by resisting and fighting against Greek culture and Roman occupation. And most Jews were kind of caught in the middle, just trying to live and survive in very difficult times. So now let's review. The major influences on life in the time of Jesus are Old Testament religion and culture, Greek culture and language, and Roman power. And the Jewish social groups are the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, the Essenes, and the people of the land. Now, hopefully this gives you a starting idea of what life was like in these times, so that you can try to imagine in this social situation as you read the New Testament. And hopefully this will help you understand what was happening in the New Testament even better. Now, there's just one more background influence behind the New Testament that I want to explore before we get to the New Testament itself, and that is the idea of the kingdom of God. And that will be the topic of the next section. But that's all for this one. Thanks for watching.